So welcome to New York Buddha Dharma. We are continuing on with our journey through Volume 1 of Chögyam Trungpa's The Profound Treasury of the Ocean of Dharma. And tonight we're on Chapter 51, Recognizing the Reality of Suffering. So the word for suffering is dukkha in Sanskrit, often translated as dissatisfaction. But really the essence of suffering is the constant attempt to maintain the existence of this fictional I that we carry around in our minds. The I lives in the stories that inhabit our minds constantly. As we walk down the street, we're telling stories about I, the hero or the heroine, on a journey to some better place or away from some danger. It's very much like any kind of fiction that in order for it to be interesting, and it always has to be interesting, there's a movement from the past to the future. And the hero or the heroine is on a dramatic arc towards a better place, either away from something undesirable or towards something desirable or both. And that arc is filled with anxiety. Just like when you watch a movie or read a novel and it's gripping, it involves you and you're sort of hopeful for the hero or the heroine and disappointed when they suffer. And it's the same thing with the I that we carry around inside. These stories, this is where ego, the Buddhist notion of ego, lives. And it's a fiction, literally, a fiction that we create in our minds and tell ourselves over and over in one form or another, lots of different stories. And oftentimes our stories are just fragments of an ongoing story. We might be worried about our financial well-being, and at different times that feeling of panic or concern comes up in a little fragment of the larger story. Or it might be a concern about one's romantic life, or one's loneliness, or one's health, or age, or all kinds of things. And we have these little fragments that come up, and these fragments are filled with anxiety. Anxiety is what drives thought. It's what takes it forward. And that anxiety is always about the well-being of I. We are very concerned to keep I alive and healthy, which is really an impossible task because I is a story. And it's a story about travail and suffering and overcoming suffering, and when we overcome it, and when we get what we're seeking, then that particular little story of I is over, and it has no interest anymore, and we move on to the next one. It's a constant form of entertainment, and in fact, entertainment is what keeps I alive. I is constantly looking for a new drama, a new proof of its existence. And the biggest proof of all are the emotions. Now, this I thrives on two fundamental errors. These are sometimes called the two veils. The veil of conflicting emotions and the veil of primitive beliefs about reality. The veil of primitive beliefs about reality is the belief that I and other have real substantial existence, that they move from the past to the future and have a duration over time, that I and other are unitary, one thing. We think that I am one thing and you are one thing, and that we are independent. Hi, Sasha. This is called the error of own being, that things have an own being, when in fact that kind of mistake only occurs in thought. Because what we actually experience in the present moment is a constant arising and passing away so fast that you can't even point to what just arose and what passed away. It's this constant flux in the present moment, as though we were in the middle of a 3D movie, happening all the time. And then the second veil is that believing in I and other, we wind up in emotional situations of conflict between the relationship between the I and the other. We always want it to be optimal, but it never is. It's always going awry. We lose our hair, we lose our love, we lose our money, we feel hungry and we want some food. There's always the feeling of lack for I. And so this is the veil of conflicting emotions, and we get all different kinds of emotions, and they're cataloged in the Buddhist teachings. And the basic ones are, depending on which system you use, they're either 5 or 6. And the basic ones are hatred and passion, desire, feeling of hunger, that's the third one, stupidity, ignorance, ignoring what's going on is the fourth one, and pride or arrogance is a fifth, and what am I leaving out? Jealousy is a sixth. Thank you. Right. Now, in the when you work with the mandala and the Buddha families, there are only 5, but when you work with the realms, there are 6. So we could deal with that another time. And Trungpa Rinpoche points out in this that the search for pleasure, which we're always engaged in, is itself painful. Because even when we think we've got pleasure, then we're afraid that we're going to lose it. And he talks about, he mentions the millionaire, that's old news, right? Now it's billionaire, who's afraid of losing their money. So even though you've got a lot of pleasure, you're afraid of losing it. And he also points out that having pain in our lives is what makes pleasure possible. Pleasure is the obverse, if you will, of pain. So if we're cold, then we want to be warm. Warm is pleasure. If we're too hot, then we'd like to cool off. And that becomes a form of pleasure. If we're hungry, we want food. If we're overfed, we want to feel, get rid of that feeling of being overfed. But basically, it's all driven by anxiety. The anxiety of wanting to be in a better place, of a feeling that where I am is not sufficient and I need to improve it. So improvement is also another version of anxiety. It's we're constantly feeling that we need to improve ourselves, our lives, our situations, and that feeling of the need for improvement is anxious. It involves a movement from where we are now into a better place, an imagined better place. All of this involves a lot of imagination, a lot of fiction, because as we walk down the street and we have these anxious thoughts, we're imagining the past and we're imagining the future. Now, the past that we imagine never actually really happened. We just, because of our particular predilections, based on our own histories, we remember certain things from the past, and we create a story about them, about how we were wronged, or how we succeeded, or how we were lacking, or whatever it may be. And you can have 2 people who stood and watched the same event, and if they recount it, you'll get 2 different versions of it, because they're seeing it through their particular filters. We see, and when we remember, when we think that we're remembering our past, we're remembering these little slivers of what actually happened, and we're remembering them through the interpretation of a particular story. So right now, if you were to remember what happened a few minutes ago in this room, you would pick out a highlight and say, that's what happened. But meanwhile, there's the heater going on over here, there's the door opening over there, there's water coming out of the faucet, who knows what it is, and all these things that we ignore because we're concerned with what is important to me and my agendas. me and my tasks. The future, likewise, is just an imagining based on our particular personalities. And it's very, very limited, what we imagine. And it never really happens, does it? I mean, when we get there, it's this. And it's never exactly the way and not even close to the way we imagined it happening. But nonetheless, we can spend a lot of time having anxious worries about our futures, imagining what's going to happen to us or hoping for what's going to happen to us. And then even if we get what we hoped for, isn't it always so disappointing? Usually. Sometimes it exceeds our expectations, but only for a minute. And then it's gone. Just like when you were a kid and you got presents at Hanukkah or Christmas, and there was this big kerfluffle when you opened your present and you were so delighted. And a few months later, it's moldering in the closet. You've forgotten it completely. So the future never really comes. He says, anxiety is always there, hovering and haunting you throughout your life. But seeing that anxiety, is a tremendous help. Usually we are so busy trying to get rid of anxiety that we don't even realize we are victimized or driven by it. Seeing it, we can have an opportunity to deal with it fundamentally. I mean, we're so absorbed in it as we walk down the street. It's kind of like when you're meditating, suddenly you realize, I've been thinking for the last 15 minutes. I've been thinking about whatever. The fight I had with my mother in Poughkeepsie. The love affair I had with so-and-so in Hawaii. Whatever it might be. And we were completely lost in that dream. And suddenly we realize that we're dreaming. And you wake up from the dream. And this is the way these dreams enslave us. It says, seeing it, we can have the opportunity to deal with it fundamentally. That's why in meditation, you don't try to get rid of thought. If you do, that's another big thought. That's another dream. That's another dream of self-improvement. It's like the dream of I'm going to become a really terrific meditator, and then people will admire me, or then I'll be free of suffering, or then peace will descend on me. And that's just another big dream. So whatever the dream is, if it's that one or another, you just see it. And in the moment of seeing it, you're very friendly to it in a way. That doesn't mean you follow it, but you actually feel that it's okay. It's the development of compassion for oneself. And it's also giving up, this is the hardest part, of ceasing to criticize yourself for thinking, because you are giving up your goal orientation when you do that. And giving up that goal orientation can be very disconcerting. Then you don't know where you're going, what you're doing, who you are. What am I going to get out of this? And instead, what we're doing, what we're exhorted to do, is simply see what is arising in our minds. And in doing that, we develop what in Buddhism we call compassion. Not a compassion of feeling sorry for, but a compassion of allowing us to be who we and what we are, which is full of thoughts. It's a friendliness towards ourselves that can be really powerful. And it involves a warmth, a friendship, and it also involves a tremendous letting go of reference points, which can be scary, because then we're floating free in the cosmos, as it were, without direction. We're just being who we are in this present moment, whatever that may be, and not moving towards a better future that we've imagined. And that's a hard thing to do, to give up that sense of journey, I find. He says, according to the Hinayana teachings, this is the first foundational stage of the path, to begin with, you could give up your scheme of what you ideally want in your life. Pleasure, enjoyment, happiness. You could give up those possibilities altogether. In turn, you could try to be kind to others, or at least stop inconveniencing them. That's a modest goal, don't you think? To stop inconveniencing them. But I mean, isn't that warm? That instead of, pursuing pleasure, enjoyment, happiness, your schemes for accomplishing those things, you could give up those possibilities altogether, and in turn, you could try to be kind to others. What a warm, friendly, actually delightful prospect. So he exhorts us, really, asks us to look into the fact, to see the difference between pursuing the way in which we are constantly trying to fix things on the one hand and addressing the basic problem on the other. The first thing is just to see that you are anxious, he says. I mean, that's tremendous. That's a tremendous act of awareness. And in the act of seeing your own anxiety, you're not anxious. There's a clarity and a freedom from the anxiety in seeing it. In order to be anxious, we have to be caught up in the dream with this feeling of forward movement towards a place we don't want, or away from a place we don't want, or towards a place that we do want. But once we actually just see it, then we're free from that enslavement to that movement. He says, understanding that anxiety, which is very frustrating, is the key to realizing where you are. The only way to work with this anxiety is by means of sitting practice, of meditation, and then you can carry that into daily life. It is by taming your mind, or shamatha practice, and this produces pratimoksha, or individual liberation. It's the liberation from suffering that is the first stage, in the Hinayana path. It's the first stage of the development of the practitioner, that you get free of this really core, fundamental anxiety by simply learning to see it without agenda and resting your mind in the present moment. He says, first you have to experience reality, things as they are, the truth of suffering. Then, the second stage, the Mahayana teachings of benevolence and loving kindness will come. And then the Vajrayana, the finally and best product of the best beginning. We start with the Hinayana practice of shamatha. The reality is that we are all trapped in samsaric neurosis, everybody, without exception. It is best that you work with reality rather than ideals. That is a good place to begin. And the reality is that we're trapped in samsaric neurosis. And the neurosis is that we are driven by anxiety. As we walk down the street, it's just amazing. Once we begin to wake up, we begin to see the extent to which we're lost in anxious dreams. Very powerful. And to see that is a tremendously liberating thing. Just in the moment of seeing it. So, we could have a discussion.
Something I'm thinking about during the talk, and I'm interested in your opinion. Do you think it's possible to selflessly wish to realize one's potential without without any notion of, you know, self-improvement coming from a place of dissatisfaction. Do you know what I'm saying? Like that, does the wish to self-improve necessarily come from a place of dissatisfaction? Even though obviously most of it does, reflecting back.
What do you think? It's on. It's on, Lane. Yep.
Personally, I think it's possible, even though the experience is very rare.
What is the experience?
Simply, simply wishing to realize one's potential, like I said, but no, I suppose it's more than that. It's, I mean, it's realizing one's potential from a more humble place. I would think.
What is one's potential?
We have many different potentials.
And give me an example. Or something you're thinking about.
Well, practically speaking, I'm always thinking about bettering myself as a musician. Although that's not an example that's very selfless. I do see a lot of pride in that.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, honestly, I suppose I don't know the answer, and that's why I'm introducing this subject.
Let's talk about being a musician. Let's say you're a guitarist. And in the beginning, you're learning how to play the guitar. And you're given instruction on how to hold it, the proper position, how to hold, if you're going to pick, how to hold the pick, if you're going to use finger picks, if you're going to use just your fingers, how to do it, how to chord and use your hands on the strings to fret the strings. And you're thinking about all these instructions. And it's very clumsy. And you're very awkward at it, right? Because you're thinking so hard about it. But as you practice and become familiar with the instrument and with the process, it begins to become second nature. And you begin to be able to play a chord, like a C chord or something, D, whatever, without even thinking about it, right? It's just there. You don't have to think, well, I need to have my finger on this string and on my middle finger on that string and my forefinger on this, the E string or whatever it might be. And you're not thinking that way. You just do it. It's the same thing. So and then your playing becomes much more fluid. Because when you're thinking about every little movement, it's very clumsy. And it's the same with all disciplines. I mean, think about when you learn to drive a car. When I learned to drive a car, it was with a stick shift. And a lot of people here are nodding their heads. And as you get it behind the wheel, you're thinking about, okay, I've got to put my left foot on the clutch, and then I can shift it into gear, right? And then I have to let my left foot up, but not too fast, because then, the car will stall and buck. And I have to let it out while I give gas to it. And you're thinking about all this, and it's so clumsy. you know? And it's actually a bit dangerous, right? Because meanwhile, you're not even looking at the road. You're thinking so much about all the different instructions that you've got. Later, it becomes second nature. You don't even think about it. You just do it. It's like you've become one with the car or one with the instrument. And then you can actually begin to master it. Not only that, but at that point, your awareness can become very natural and very relaxed and very panoramic. You know, it's like when you drive the car. If you're a beginner and you're thinking about every little thing, about how you have to turn on the turn signal when I'm going to turn left, and you know how I have to reach and shift gears and step on the brake and all this stuff, you know, your awareness is not panoramic at all, and it's actually much more dangerous. You're not aware of the whole environment around the car. But later, when you have absorbed all this, all the instructions, and it's become second nature, then you drive the car without even thinking. It's part of you. Just like the way it's part of us to speak. You know, like I'm speaking now. I don't have to think about how to do it. And your awareness is wide. You're aware of the whole road and any obstacles or dangers that might be coming towards you, so that you can drive much more safely. So I put it to you this way, that if one is self-consciously trying to improve oneself and be better, it actually works against you. That it makes you much more jerky and low performing. I used to spend a lot of time rock climbing, you know, back in the day. I lived in Boulder, Colorado for 30 years and spent a lot of time out on cliffs. And it was just every climber knew that familiarity and confidence was key. And that if you lacked those qualities, you became a bad climber. And it was actually dangerous. You know? But when you know, people talk about flow states. It's because the person is not checking on themselves. They're not thinking about you know, how well I'm doing or not doing and hoping for a better outcome. They're just in a flow state. I've seen this so many times with climbers. I remember trying a really hard problem. There's a thing you do in climbing called top roping, where you put up a rope on a very difficult problem, and it's like a pulley. And one guy stands at the bottom, and he's taking up the rope as the other guy who's tied to the other end climbs up. And then if that person falls, well, they don't go anywhere. You know, they just fall on the end of the rope because the rope's being taken up like that, like a big pulley. And I was top roping a terrifically difficult problem with a friend who was really an excellent climber, famous climber. And he went up and did the problem. And I lowered him down. He finished, and then I let the rope out, and he comes down like that. And then I went up, and I failed. And I couldn't do it. And I'm swinging up there, you know. And so I tried it again. And then I tried it again. I don't know how many times I tried it. Finally, he lowered me off. And he said to me, "You know what you're doing wrong?" And I thought he was going to tell me, well, I should have put my right hand there and my left hand here, or my foot there, or whatever it was, you know, some kind of mechanical movement thing. And I said, "No, tell me." And he said, "You're wondering, can I do this?" He said, "At this level of difficulty, you can't be thinking that. You know, you've just got to be completely confident and doing it." That's the way we live our lives. I mean, that's how we have awareness, you know. And if we're thinking, "Gosh, I hope I'm going to get better at this, and what I'm going to get out of it," it's second rate. I mean, I'll bet, Charlie, that when you're playing playing your instrument, the best moments are when you're completely lost in it, you know, and there's no, or very little anyhow, thought of checking, how am I doing? There's just a total enjoyment of the process, and you're caught up in the flow. Musicians talk about this all the time. great musicians. I was thinking about Yo-Yo Ma tonight, and what an extraordinary human being he is. And I can't imagine that he's thinking, gosh, I wish I could do it better. Yeah.
Yeah, let me just mention in part why I brought up the question. There's this saying from Suzuki Roshi that I really love. He says, "You're all perfect as you are, and you could use a little improvement." But I think, like, given what you just said, what occurs to me is that improvement just happens as a result of practice. It's nothing we have to be concerned about.
Yeah.
But we certainly need practice.
Certainly need to sit, yeah, and need to take it out into the world too. That's really true.
Is it on?
You got it.
One of the things that really stood out with me with this chapter was talking about neurosis and anxiety. The line between self-absorption and self-care. A lot of neurosis and anxiety. It's because people are self-absorbed. You become self-absorbed in what's going on in your life. And when I remind myself of that, it lifts me out of it.
It what?
It helps lift me out of it, and
right.
It reminds me that there are other people on this earth, and compassion comes back into my life again. But you know, it's a very slippery slope to go from self-care to self-absorption. It's a pattern for many people. I know it can be for me at times too. Right. But it really resonated with me in this reading this chapter.
I think that the more we come present, you know, just right here, clear, open awareness, and the more we are kind to ourselves, not being hard on ourselves in our meditation practice and in other ways, those two things, then the more our heart opens to the world around us. And the key really is the meditation practice of coming present again and again. And when we come present, we let go of self-absorption. Self-absorption is always in here, like, how am I doing? You know, I'm worried about me, you know. And then when we come present into the world, we're available for others.
But the stings from the outside world, the stings that you feel from the outside world are still there at times.
The stings.
The stings. It takes a while. Sometimes it takes a little while for those to dissipate. And one of the ways that dissipate is compassion for other people. But you do need to process and go through what you're going through also.
Yes, I agree. Yeah. Right. Isabel is nodding, yes, to what are you nodding to?
Yeah, I remember I had a phase where I was very depressed for years actually, and it came with a strong physical sensation also.
What came with the strong physical?
Depression.
Huh?
Depression.
Depression.
In my body, like there was pressure on my chest, on my throat, in my mouth, against my palate. So I do remember that I followed these instructions, and I oftentimes had problems with this physical sensation, kind of, you know, the story and the thoughts and the physical that would be like oscillating back and forth, like, because when the story is gone, the physical was there, and then from the physical the story arises.
From the physical? From
the physical and back and forth. And I mean, I haven't felt like that for a long time, but when I try to help friends who are in like high states of anxiety, which is mostly also accompanied by physical, and I try to talk about noticing, just notice. They say, yes, I notice, but it's so strong, you know. So that's a bit of a struggle to just notice when it comes in such intensity.
Right.
Yeah, that's one thing I wanted to say, and the other thing was the moment. The moment is really so key, right? When you're in suffer, and you're really you're in the moment, and you can even almost tell yourself, this moment I'm okay, right? Because in this very moment you are actually okay. And then it comes all back. And then comes the next moment, and the next, and that helps breaking it up sometimes.
Yeah.
No question, really. Just comments.
Yeah. That all makes complete sense. I find that with regard to depression, that I think that it's true for many people that the most vulnerable time of day is the morning when you wake up. Because your mind is still caught up in thought, you know, the dream of the night. And there's this big distinction between the physical world and, of course, the mental world. And the physical world is a great aid, and it pulls us out of thought. You know, you stub your toe, you come back out of thought. You know, you were daydreaming absent-mindedly, and you catch your finger in a door. That'll wake you up. So the physical world is a great reminder. And what I find is that one can be lying in bed having depressed thoughts. I remember Trungpa Rinpoche used to say, you know, that this is the most vulnerable time in the morning, the early morning, when you're just waking up. But as soon as you get out of bed and you start to move and your feet hit the floor and you go to the bathroom, you know, and you urinate and you brush your teeth and maybe wash your face or do whatever you do, the physicality of all of that pulls you out of thought and into an awareness, a vipassana, if you will, awareness, brings you back into the real world. And the thought thins and maybe clears, you know, away, and the fog of that unhappiness, depression, those depressed thoughts evaporates. It's just like that all the time. I mean, in the Tibetan teachings having to do with death, the bardo of becoming, you know, is the last period of time in the space between death and rebirth. And in the bardo of becoming, the person is going to be reborn. And it's a purely mental place. In fact, everything is, because, you know, you've lost the whole world in death. And in that mental place, everything is very, very changeable, just as it is in dreams. One minute you can be in Tallahassee, and the next minute you can be in Moscow. You know, your mind is constantly creating that and changing like that. And one minute you can be happy, and the next minute you can be scared to death. In the bardo state, it's supposed to be a very scary place, and they say it's full of noise. And Dzogchen Khyentse Rinpoche said that if you want to experience what it's like in the bardo of becoming, the closest thing would be to go and sit and meditate in Times Square. Which Kerry Tamura, you know, he does. He takes people there, and they go sit in Times Square. So, and I've done it with him, and it's wild. I mean, you know, everybody's rushing by, and there's noise, and the cars and trucks, and the lights are flashing on the buildings, and it's crazy. And he says that's what it's like in the bardo of becoming. So, and then our awareness, though, as we come back into the present, it clears away those anxious, frightened, hopeful, and fearful thoughts. In the Sadhana of Mahamudra, Rinpoche talks about the bandits of hope and fear. The bandits. They steal our lives away. And the only real solution is meditation practice. And meditation means waking up from these dreams and coming back to the world, the real world, which only lives in the present. All the rest of it is mental construct. I think it takes a tremendous letting go. You know, in the Kagyu lineage chant, do you do that at Nalanda Bodhi? Yeah. And you know, the first, after you go through the lineage, the first stanza goes, however it's translated, it's either revulsion, I like renunciation better. Huh? Yeah. I like it, sometimes it's renunciation, you know, translated that way. Is the foot of meditation as is taught, not being possessed by food and wealth. To the meditator who cuts the ties to such a life, grant your blessing so that I will not be attached to honor and gain. And for me, what that means is that we're letting go of the dreams, the hopes and fears having to do with food, wealth, honor, gain of the past and the future. And we're just going to float free in the present. And that's actually almost a scary prospect. We lose our reference points, you know, where we are, where we've been, and where we're going. Yes? Microphone. At least I find it scary. It's kind of like having the rug pulled out from underneath your feet.
So how do you let go and deal with the requirements of society?
You deal better with them when you're not distracted by self-absorbed thoughts about my past and my future and my hopes and my worries and my fears and my pride and all of that. That makes us unavailable. It's like when you drive the car. If you're thinking about it really hard, you're going to be a lousy driver. But when you're right here, you've absorbed it all, you see, and we've all absorbed how to relate with other human beings properly. And when you've absorbed the instructions, like for how to drive the car, you don't even have to think about it. You're right there, present, and better able to drive the car in a way that's safe, accurate, skillful, because you're not thinking about it. It's the same thing. That's why, you know, they say that a Buddha is endlessly skillful. It's because they're not lost in thought. That person is present, available, responsive. If a car comes out of nowhere, you know, and sort of starts in front of them, they can put their foot on the brake because they're right there. They're not lost in a dream. It's the same thing. We don't trust it. We think, gosh, if I'm not thinking about it, I'm not going to be able to do it. But in fact, thought really screws us up. It slows us down. It makes things very awkward, clumsy. Think about the analogy of driving a car. I think that's a good one. But there's so many. The climbing one, if you've ever done sports. I mean, your musicianship, you know? I mean, if you're thinking about it too much, doesn't it get in the way? When you're really just right there with confidence, with joy, you know, in the music, it flows, it comes out beautifully. So our practice is constantly meditation. The heart of meditation is to come back into the present moment again and again, to cut through those anxious, hope and fear-driven thoughts.
That also reminds me of what Yogi Berra used to say.
Oh yeah, this will be good.
The future ain't what it used to be.
The future ain't what it used to be, yeah. He was amazing.
And I find most people, like I've noticed this, that most people, to avoid pain in the present, they escape into the past or the future. And then with the advent of movies, now they're escaping into alternate realities.
I don't think, I argue with you. We could have an argument about this, and I'm not sure who's right. But I don't think people escape into the past or the future. I think what happens is that we want to keep that me alive, and so we entertain that me with thoughts of the past and the future, about which are very emotional and fraught with hope and fear. And that, because I is always the protagonist in those thoughts. That's why when people are sitting on the subway You sit on the subway and everybody's got their phone out. It's because it's almost threatening not to have something to feed back, to keep you entertained.
Or distracted.
Distracted. Yeah. Distracted from what? From the present moment. Yeah.
Son? Two things, but Lane, just to address what Lane said, what motivates us to practice? First of all, one thing that John said in his talk was that we shouldn't be, or it wouldn't, when we start to notice that we're really being a nuisance to others and to ourselves, that's a great motivation. Other than the fact that, let's say the Buddha said practice, and we're interested in what he said, so we follow his example, which is kind of, straightforward. But when we start to see after a while, we start to meditate after a while, we see how we're constantly being an irritant to ourselves and to others. And to me, that's a really great motivation to stop causing harm, which is really the Hinayana, the beginning. And then also, the other thing about not fixating on ourselves, once we stop doing that and planning and scheming about future events or how we want things to go, we can have kind of an overview, but if we're very rigid, we miss the magic of the phenomenal world. Because there's so much magic that comes to us when we're not shut down, when we're open, spacious, and relaxed. And that's where I find the interesting part of being alive is that we're not really in that much control of what happens, but sometimes what happens is really amazing, even if it's horrible. It's still kind of just like being alive and being open to the world in a certain way that's not controlled about every single thing that we do. And then just like one little thing that changes the environment is just walking down the street and looking at people passing us by, coming towards us. We're walking out, they're coming in, and just looking at their faces and just smiling, but not in a crazy way, but just like lift our face in a happy way that changes the environment, because we're actually kind of like noticing that another human being who has Buddha nature is coming towards you, and it's a joyful thing.
The reason why I'm laughing right now.
Hold it up to your mouth.
The reason why. Is that okay now? Oh, okay. The reason why I'm laughing right now is in terms of what you were saying, Rochelle, and what happens sometimes when you're in rush hour and you actually feel like you're a car that's bumping back and forth. And I just could not believe an experience that happened. And I just was walking, and it was another bumping into me. And at first I was irritated. And then I actually thought, well, I don't know, I have to find a way to work with this differently. And it became like, okay, who's the next one? It was really wild. but the speed that comes at you. So as a practitioner, if you're able to actually stop your mind at that moment, it really helps.
Well, maybe we should end here. What do you think? So we could close with the dedication of merit, if you're willing. By this merit may all attain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing, from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness and death. From the ocean of samsara may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great east, may the lotus garden of the Rigdon's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory.